Hey folks, this is Jean Tiberio, and you're listening to Healing Outside the Box. Now, I have to tell you that I had the best of intentions to put out a new episode about how Monsanto has gone underground, but is really still slithering around under the name of Bayer. But that episode will have to wait until next week. I usually finish editing on Friday night, but last night I went to a vigil for the migrant families at the border to show our support. It was one of 800 vigils happening Friday night worldwide, and it was really cool to be part of it. There are plenty of people who care out there. That was my takeaway. So I went to this vigil with a couple of friends, and therefore I like to say we were the 3 vigilantes. Now, Salem, Massachusetts is already a sanctuary city, but local politicians are looking to make it even more of a sanctuary city. So there were a lot of speakers last night, and I learned a lot of things. One of the things I learned is that there is actually an ICE detention center right here in Burlington, Massachusetts, about 10 miles south of here. Say it ain't so, but apparently it is so. So as the great activist Elie Wiesel once said, the opposite of love is not hate. It's indifference. So I think we're getting the message. Anyway, the vigil went on for 2 hours, and they had lots of great speakers. So, needless to say, I did not get around to editing the podcast episode. So I thought I'd put up a repeat of last summer's episode, which is about leaky gut. Or more specifically, do we have a leaky gut? And if we do we also have a leaky brain? So enjoy the lovely summer and this episode, and I'll see you next week for another episode of Healing Outside the Box. This is episode 184. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to Healing Outside the Box. My name is Jean Tiberio, and I'm a nutritionist and a wellness coach. You're listening to episode 184, and I'm calling it, Could We Have a Leaky Gut and a Leaky Brain? I don't know. Now, I'm here to tell you that after surfing the World Wide Web, that I still don't know. But that's not going to stop me from giving you my opinion on the subject. And the reason why you'll get mostly opinions at this stage is because the actual research on the subject is still in its infancy. I'm only going to scratch the surface today, but I plan to do a more exhaustive literature search and perhaps do another episode about just the leaky brain sometime in the future. Now, when it comes to the gut and the possibility that our leaky gut is creating problems, there is plenty of evidence to suggest that. We now know that the lining of cells between your gut and your bloodstream can be damaged by a number of factors. The damage creates holes, and we now call those holes a leaky gut. This is all pretty much mainstream knowledge at this point. What is not known is how to definitively fix it. Now, I'm sure you know that gluten is getting a very bad reputation, and when we eliminate gluten from our diets, the symptoms seem to get better. What we're eliminating when we eliminate gluten is a big fat protein that gets through because our damaged gut lining is letting substances go through that should have been broken down first. So when we eliminate gluten, we're not necessarily fixing the damage. We're stopping the consequences of gluten getting into our bloodstream whole. Now, if gluten's a protein, why is it creating inflammation? It's creating a problem because normally our proteins get broken down into single amino acids before they pass through into our bloodstream. I have lots of podcast episodes on leaky gut, and I can put them all in the show notes for you if you'd like to review them. Today, however, I'm opening a can of worms and asking the question, can we also have a leaky brain? And if so, is this a factor in the increase in many chronic brain conditions? Let's step back for a moment and talk about the biology of the brain. We have tons of blood vessels feeding our brain. We have millions of neurons, which are basically brain cells connecting from end to end, and that creates an electrical current that transmits messages. We need to get nutrients into our brain to make all this happen. We need proteins to build new cells and make things like enzymes. We need carbohydrates for energy. We need fatty acids for our cellular structure and functions, and various minerals like magnesium that help run the machinery. For example, magnesium is necessary for energy metabolism, and our brain uses a lot of energy. The wall of cells that lies between our bloodstream and our brain tissue is called the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is formed by a layer of endothelial cells that line the walls of our blood vessels. If you guessed that we need this barrier to be intact in order to avoid toxic substances getting through, then you would be correct. In that way, it's exactly like that single layer of cells between the inside of our intestines and our sterile bloodstream. The blood-brain barrier is also semi-permeable, meaning that it allows certain things in and it blocks other things when it's healthy. This permeability can be negatively affected by things like too much alcohol or high blood pressure. Now, much of the research that's done on this blood-brain barrier has been done to examine pharmaceuticals. So we do know a little bit about the physical barrier between the bloodstream and the brain. Again, the wall itself is only a single layer of endothelial cells, which makes this wall delicate. It's very delicate. It's like lace, or perhaps, as one researcher put it, it's like cheesecloth. And what you want is cheesecloth. You do not want lace. This layer of cheesecloth is exactly like the barrier between the inside of our gut and our bloodstream. Because the blood-brain barrier is delicate, when this barrier of a single layer of cells gets damaged, all kinds of bad things can happen. Because everything that got into our bloodstream from our leaky gut is now getting into our brain, presumably. And we should know by now how complicated our brain is and how devastating the effects of damage to our brain cells. The science about the possible damage to the blood-brain barrier is still in its infancy, as I've mentioned. But an increasing number of scientists are sticking their necks out right now in rendering an opinion that what happened to our leaky gut, i.e. allowing big proteins to get through that don't belong there, can happen in our brain. Obviously, an inflammatory response is possible because our body likes to attack things that don't belong there. Also, oxidative damage, possibly the birth of autoimmune disorders, and even the growth of tumor cells. It is my opinion, based on not that much evidence, admittedly, that this may in fact be going on inside of our brains now. Big plasma proteins, in other words blood proteins, and other substances that don't belong inside our brain are getting into our brain. Theoretically, that is. Because our bodies are so great at attacking invaders, this can cause inflammation in our brains. The long-term effects of chronic inflammation in our brains hasn't been investigated fully, but I think we can guess that bad things may happen. There's been a few studies by scientists in animals. A study done in mice recently discovered that chronic sleep deprivation, especially lack of REM sleep, may increase the permeability of that blood-brain barrier. So that's interesting. In other words, the more we know, the more we learn. Also, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that excessive alcohol on a regular basis can create accumulation of the byproducts of alcohol digestion. One of the byproducts is acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde loosens up the blood-brain barrier and may result in increased leakage. That last part has not been proven, but if I were to guess at it, I would say it probably does. The hangover that we get when we have too much to drink the night before is caused by acetaldehyde. And that's specifically in our brain, not just in our bloodstream. And I think we can also guess that anything that causes us to feel like we've had a hangover, in other words, very foggy-headed, headache, etc., is not a good thing in general. And I'm hinting at something here. Perhaps I should just come out and say it. A ketogenic diet, or a diet that creates a lot of ketones in our brain, may create a situation that can provoke some long-term damage. And we all know the diets that I'm talking about. The high-protein, high-fat, Atkins-type diets. I'm sorry, keto people, but I have to make another plug for the Mediterranean diet over the ketogenic diet. Before I get into how we are going to fix our leaky brains, I wanted to just let you in on a few tidbits of information that connects the gut to the brain. Let's just talk about the numbers first. The incidence of irritable bowel syndrome and Crohn's disease has been steadily rising since the 1990s. Both are linked to leaky gut. Also, the incidence of Alzheimer's disease in women has been steadily rising since the 1990s. Also, the incidence of Parkinson's disease in men has been steadily rising since the 1990s. I think you get the picture. If enough diseases are walking and quacking like a duck, then we may have a herd of ducks on our hands. Or is it gaggle? Is it gaggle of geese? I don't know. I'll have to ask my Wikipedia expert who's out to lunch. Anyway, so we know there is a clear connection between substances made in and near the gut and substances in our brain. For example, 90% of the serotonin made in our body is made in our gut. I find that kind of interesting. So, without dragging this on too long, I'm implying that if our gut microbiome and our brain are connected, can what happens in our gut also affect our brain? When our semi-permeable gut lining gets damaged, it becomes inflamed. Because so much of our immune system is located in our gut, the inflammation with the swelling creates immune system dysfunction. At this point, this is scientific fact. What it creates is a situation where the immune system is constantly on and no longer recognizes food versus toxins versus something else. The immune system also becomes hypersensitive to particles that get through. Can the same thing happen in our brains? I'm just guessing, as everyone else is, but I would put money on it at this point. Okay, so how do we fix the leaky brain, assuming that we have one? This is going to sound like common sense, and it is, but why not list it off numerically anyway? Number 1, get adequate sleep. And by adequate, they're talking about 7 to 9 hours per night. REM sleep is preferable, if possible. If you're dreaming on a regular basis, you're probably getting good REM sleep. By the way, REM means rapid eye movements. And recently there's been some interesting work regarding whether or not we can help people by creating a situation that makes rapid eye movements. I find this fascinating. I'll give you an example. Sometimes when I'm doing transcendental meditation, I get rapid eye movements just occurring naturally. I just let them come because I generally feel more relaxed coming out of the meditation when that happens. So if something is helping, then I guess we can assume it's working. If something, say a hangover, is not helping, I think you can assume that it's hurting. It's possible that instead of just adding to your risk of being irritable, you may be adding to your risk of getting more brain fog as you age and perhaps even Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. Number 2. So it comes as no surprise, I imagine, that the second recommendation to prevent a leaky brain might be to limit your alcohol intake. A glass of wine per day is largely considered okay in this regard. But if you're drinking enough to have symptoms the next morning, acetaldehyde is accumulating inside your brain. This can result in damage to your neurons and increase the risk of a leaky blood-brain barrier if one in fact exists. Number 3. Blood pressure control. Chronic high blood pressure can increase your risk of stroke. We all know that. But some people now think that chronic high blood pressure can make that blood-brain barrier more permeable. If that's the case, decreasing your blood pressure will solve that problem. There are many ways to do that, and you should speak with your personal healthcare professional if your blood pressure is high. Number 4. Reduce the saturated fat in your diet. Another reason why ketogenic diets may not be such a good thing. So what type of diet will reduce your saturated fat in your diet? I bet you can guess that it's plant foods. Dark green leafy vegetables, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, high fiber plants in general, I suppose, and beans. In addition, magnesium, turmeric, and garlic can also help keep your leaky brain intact. And I should also mention, whatever keeps your gut bacteria happy is a good idea for your brain. Remember that the cells along the lining of your brain and your gut are the same endothelial cells and work in the same way. Inflammation will happen in the same way when those cells are damaged. So in addition to reducing the saturated fat, I'll stick my neck out and recommend good nutrition to keep your healthy gut microbes reproducing. Number 5. Taking a multivitamin with B6 and B12 might be a good idea. Also, a substance called inositol may help, and you can always get that as a supplement if you choose to do so. If not, eating nutrient-rich foods will give you plenty of all these substances. Number 6. Although there really isn't science to back this up yet, some people recommend stimulating the vagus nerve. How do you do that? Well, they mention meditating, chanting, singing, deep breathing exercises, as you might do with breathing meditations. I think you get the picture. We all know that these exercises do no harm, and in general, they do a lot of good. So trying these techniques and perhaps giving yourself a regular routine of any of these will only help you. Some people also recommend splashing cold water on your face, which appears to stimulate the vagus nerve. Again, what harm could it do? So the bottom line is this: whether we find out that all of this is true or some of this is true, if it's a healthy thing to do, then it's a good thing to do. That's all I have for you today. Be well and stay tuned next week for another episode of Healing Outside the Box.